समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
For weeks now, the world's been watching images of absolute horror emerging from al-Fashir in Sudan, where two rival groups have been conducting a slaughter almost biblical in its magnitude. In this episode of Security Code, I'll be unpackaging why this killing is taking place and how the world's decision to normalize and ignore the brutal imposition of theocratic punishments over many decades enabled Sudan's society to slowly collapse and become a place of maximum horror. Like lava pouring through his veins into his heart, Nuruddin Ahmad Esa remembered the moment the knife cut through his limbs. He watched as a prison guard paraded his amputated right arm and left leg before a cheering crowd. The brutal punishments had begun in the winter of 1983 as Sudan imposed Sharia law. Thousands of bottles of alcohol were poured into the Nile, women were stoned on suspicion of sex outside marriage, gender segregation was ruthlessly enforced, and Indian businessman Lalit Ratanlal Shah lost all his assets on charges of riba or usury. 300 men are reported to have lost one limb or more before the terror ended in December 1984. Their arms and legs cut off using especially imported knives sent on the recommendation of a doctor who had trained in amputation techniques in Saudi Arabia. 4 decades after that time of horror, which were instituted to impose an Islamic national identity on a Sudan riven by religious and ethnic fractures, the country has again suffered a partition, with its largely Christian South seceding. The endless hunger of hate is still being fed, though. This time, the slaughter involves Sudan's Muslim communities, which have been targeted in a civil war that has claimed tens of thousands of lives since 2023. Last week, insurgents of the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, overran the town of al-Fashir in the western Darfur region, engaging in mass killings, rape, and brutal torture. Even patients at a maternity ward were slaughtered. The slaughter offers a terrifying glimpse of what the world can look like when the international community and global institutions are happy to let mass killers rule. The group responsible for the butchery in al-Fashir is widely believed to have been equipped and funded by the United Arab Emirates in a bid to prevent the Muslim Brotherhood from exercising power in Khartoum. The Sudanese armed forces, or the official forces of the government, for their part, have the backing of both Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Like many post-colonial countries, as scholar Ali Bob has noted, Sudan acquired nationhood before it became a nation. Along a mosaic of multi-ethnic and multi-religious communities, the territories of northern Sudan were conquered by Ottoman Egypt in 1820-1821. Egypt could never establish full political control over the southern parts of Sudan, though, and English missionaries from Kenya became increasingly active in the late 19th century, bringing Christianity to those regions. The rule of Egypt was decisively overthrown in 1885 by the Islamic religious leader Muhammad Ahmad, who united central and western Sudan. From 1898, Imperial Britain took control of all of the territories of modern Sudan, though the name of the country itself was simply borrowed from medieval Arab geographers who used the word Sudan to refer to, I quote, the land of the black people. The British, as historian Gerard Prunier notes, committed little funding to modernizing Sudan, and what little was spent went to the tribes of Khartoum and the Blue Nile province around the centers of imperial power. The new imperial colony defied simple categorization. Although the tribes of Darfur, the western part, are often distinguished as ethnically black African as opposed to Arab, there is little to racially distinguish these labels, Prunier points out. The largely Christian South, similarly, shares a language and many cultural elements with its northern Islamic neighbors. Following independence in 1955, Sudan crafted a constitution that sought to reconcile Islam with Christian and animist traditions. The country's Islamic elite, though, soon began to stifle the aspirations of the South. There was a process of state sponsored Islamization and a backlash in the form of an insurgency. The northern leadership refused to give ground. The Muslim Brotherhood leader Hassan al-Turabi proclaimed that, I quote, the South has no culture, thus the vacuum would necessarily be filled by an Arab culture under an Islamic revival. Following a coup in 1969, military ruler Ghaffar Muhammad al-Nimeri sought another pragmatic reconciliation with the South. An accord signed with the southern rebels in 1972 promised to respect the region's religion and customs. Facing economic crisis and demands for regional autonomy in his home terrain, however, al-Nimeri declared himself Imam, the theocratic ruler of all Sudan. The title, he claimed, entitled him to absolute obedience. To secure the support of the Muslim Brotherhood and gain sponsorship from Saudi Arabia, al-Nimeri declared an Islamic state. The institution of Sharia punishment was just part of a wider program that hollowed out Sudan's policy, among them the abolition of income tax and the prohibition of interest, two pillars of a modern economy. The severe economic crisis that followed brought about another coup in 1985 in which al-Nimeri was dethroned. 4 years of failed democratization later, yet another coup brought Brigadier Omar al-Bashir to power in 1989. Like other theocratic states, meanwhile, Sudan's dystopia became ever more bizarre. In 2012, for example, 9 women were sentenced to being lashed in public simply because they'd worn trousers. Even though al-Bashir conceded a referendum that led to the independence of oil-rich South Sudan in 2011, he continued to consolidate the Islamic State his predecessors had founded. Following his coup, al-Bashir appeared with a Kalashnikov rifle in one hand and the Quran in the other, vowing, I quote, to purge the enemies of the people and of the armed forces. Together with al-Turabi, he reinstated harsh Sharia punishments. In 1999, courts in the town of Nyala were reported to have sentenced 18 people to hanging and amputation of the right leg and left hand, and in some cases, crucifixion. Al-Bashir's regime provided safe haven to Al-Qaeda chief Osama bin Laden. Al-Qaeda used its bases in Sudan to attempt the assassination of Egypt's president Hosni Mubarak and to support terrorist attacks against the World Trade Center in New York. Though Sudan expelled Osama bin Laden in 1996, frustration over al-Bashir's continued support of terrorism led the United States to bomb the country 2 years later, controversially hitting targets that may have had very little to do with terrorism. Fighting meanwhile flared up in the Darfur region to the west, evidence that religion was not enough to unite a nation. Since the 1970s, members of pastoral tribes like the Rizegat, the Habania, and the Beni Halba, who identify as Arab, had settled in southern Darfur, escaping drought in their traditional lands. From the mid-1980s, members of these tribes were recruited as militia in the fight against the South Sudan Christian secessionists. Armed and organized, these militias soon began grabbing land from local black African tribes such as the Fur and the Zaghawa. The violence escalated with the so-called Janjaweed militia. Janjaweed is a word for evil horsemen, brutally killing and raping their rivals in Darfur. The RSF, led by Darfur-born Arab leader Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo, known universally as Hemeti or Little Ahmad, grew out of the Janjaweed in 2013. An uprising led to al-Bashir's overthrow in 2019. Then, in 2021, Hemati allied with the SAF's Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and staged yet another coup. Little, of course, changed but the faces. Just 2 years back, 20-year-old Mariam Tirab became the first woman to be sentenced to death by stoning under the SAF RSF regime on charges of zina or adultery. Even though al-Bashir ended up in prison, Khartoum's genocide management has proved pretty successful. Following 9/11, the Central Intelligence Agency and MI6, the British Secret Service, began quiet counter-terrorism cooperation with Sudan's Secret Service, according to Prunier. Later, Sudan's military sent over 1,000 troops to fight alongside Saudi Arabia in Yemen, earning them the kingdom's goodwill. Khartoum successfully ensured that United Nations peacekeepers would not be deployed in Darfur, allowing only troops from the African Union to operate on the ground. Following the eviction of al-Bashir from power, the United Nations African Union mission wound down, leaving Darfur and the rest of Sudan to cope as best it could. Funding for emergency aid and reconstruction has been desperately short, but the RSF and SAF are acquiring ever more sophisticated and lethal weaponry. The four-country alliance now involved in diplomatic efforts to end the violence, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, has been pushing for a truce. There's no sign, though, that either the UAE or Saudi Arabia are willing to abandon their clients. The fall of al-Fashir complicates the process, setting in place a de facto partition of Sudan between Darfur and the rest of the country. 14 million refugees and 25 million facing acute hunger should be reason enough for the world to dismantle the dystopia that's flowered in Sudan, even if the sadism of its rulers were not enough reason. The lesson al-Fashir has sent, though, is that no kind of suffering is powerful enough to make the world act. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor with ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of Security Code.